Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to the Sweetwater Minute. This week on the Sweetwater Minute, we are joined by Andrew Munro. Thank you for coming in.
Pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Enjoying it.
Now, your company is Munro Acoustics in the UK.
That's right.
And you also have an extensive background as a sound engineer and as a speaker designer, which we're going to get to your new speakers here in just one second.
That's right.
But let's begin by talking a little bit about how you got into what you're doing now, what your background is.
Yep. Okay. Well, I started in a fairly conventional sort of way. I studied mechanical engineering at university, and then by sheer luck, really, my first job was with Shaw Microphones.
Okay.
And I spent a very happy 5 years with them. And as part of that, basically, I started to learn about acoustics, basically, because one of my jobs at Shaw, and it sounds like the dream ticket, basically, was to go out on the road with Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, and bands like that, who were all endorsees of Shaw Microphones.
Okay.
And I had to make sure that the mics worked perfectly every time. So I really didn't have to do very much apart from make sure they were plugged in and working. And Showco were doing the sound for most of these things at the time, so I got to know them quite well. But out of that, basically, I had a very deep interest in the sound system design and acoustics part of what was going on. And I realized that I couldn't realistically do that within Shaw. So I decided to branch out on my own. Basically, I did that in 1980. I started my own company.
Okay.
And that was basically acoustic consultancy and design.
Great, right.
And out of that came a relationship with Dynaudio in Denmark. We started custom building monitor systems, and we liked the Dynaudio drivers, started using them a lot. So I went to Dynaudio and I said, hey, you're not in the professional monitor business, but you should be. So why don't we set up a joint venture? And that became Dynaudio Acoustics. And that was set up in 1990, and it's still running today. Right.
So there's the Dynaudio production speakers, but then you also make custom versions of those for installations of those kinds of things.
What happened basically was that TC and Dynaudio are basically in the same town in Denmark, and TC had a very big worldwide distribution network, whereas Dynaudio Acoustics didn't, basically. So a deal was done whereby TC took over the distribution worldwide of all the standard products, and I would carry on making the bigger systems in the UK and selling them as Dynaudio Acoustics custom systems. But I did have a hand in the design of most of the original Dynaudio Acoustics monitors, like the BM5, BM6, the BM15, and the bigger ones, the M1, M2, M3, M4, and so on. So I still have an involvement with the company.
It sounds like you're deeply involved with what's going on there.
Yeah, but I wanted to do my own thing, basically, and that's where we are now.
So you must be busy because you've designed something like 1,000 studios and auditoriums and venues of different types.
That's come about basically because we branched out from doing purely music studios into film, post-production, broadcast, and all sorts of live venue installations as well. For example, we've just completed the design of the studios for the new BBC broadcasting house in London. And that was 30 studios, just in one hit.
It's a small little project.
Yeah. So that's the biggest engineering project in broadcast that's ever been done, possibly with the exception of the one in China, the huge central Chinese broadcasting venue that was done for the Olympics.
Right.
That's possibly bigger, but the BBC one is definitely the second biggest that's ever been done.
So how long did you work on that?
2 years, basically.
2 years.
On the installation side, but before that, 4 years of planning and design, prototyping studios. We built glass studios, basically, because it's a very large, deep span building. They didn't want to block out all the light with studios, so we made all the studios out of glass.
Wow, which creates some interesting acoustical situations to deal with.
All the acoustic treatment is basically hanging within the room as hanging baffles and curtains and so on.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It works fine. It's just an interesting take on the whole thing, basically.
Right.
So we, on top of all of this, I've been working on the egg system as well.
Right, which is the monitors you see behind us here. It's a joint venture between your company and SE Electronics.
Yeah. Basically, SE came to me. They wanted to have an acoustic consultant look at their acoustic products, like the reflection filter and that sort of thing, but also look maybe at new product development where we could go. And I said, well, what I really want to do is build a monitor system from scratch. Yeah, absolutely. Start with a blank piece of paper. No preconceptions about which drivers to use, what kind of system it should be. And they went with that. They said, yeah, okay, we'll take it on.
Wow, so let you just run free with whatever you wanted to do.
Yeah. And I had an idea in my head from the beginning, basically, to follow up on some original research that was done on spherical loudspeakers. And there were some research and some papers published back in the 50s by Bell Laboratories on the ideal shape for loudspeaker cabinets. And the only one that didn't exhibit what I would call diffraction artifacts was the spherical shape, or something very near spherical. And spherical has downsides in acoustic terms because it's too regular as a shape. So the football shape or the egg shape became the favoured one.
So that helps with, the egg shape helps with cancelling out all the resonances within the cabinet?
It does that as well. Primarily we did it to eliminate diffraction effects on the outside. When sound falls off the edge of a baffle, basically it drops 6 dB, it goes from 4 pi to 2 pi space basically. That creates a series of comb filters because it happens every half wavelength. And that interferes basically with the sound of the speaker. So
this is as the sound comes out of the front of the speaker and goes around and off the sides?
Basically, in order to create sound pressure, the movement of the molecules, if you like, that are excited by the driver have to push on something in order to create pressure. Otherwise, you wouldn't hear it. Moving molecules don't actually excite the ear. Only pressure excites the ear. So you have to have something to push against, and the molecules are pushing against the speaker cabinet. So the more smooth and regular and symmetrical in the sound field the box or the cabinet is, the more smoothly those molecules will radiate. So you get a truly spherical wavefront as opposed to an interrupted wavefront. Which sounds quite technical, but it's actually very logical if you think about it. And the net result of that is you get a very smooth frequency response with no discontinuities at all.
Where does it make the most difference? Is it most apparent in the mid-range, the high frequencies, the low frequencies, or is it equally dispersed over those?
All of those things can be, to some extent, equalized. What it makes a difference to basically is the stereo imaging and the balance and perspective of the sound. People in the hi-fi business talk about depth and the sort of the three-dimensional aspect of a stereo sound. And this has got a lot to do with this, which is basically phase, basically. What the ear is incredibly sensitive to is phase. And if it wasn't, we wouldn't know where things were coming from. Basically, it's as simple as that. And it's basically extracting the greatest amount of integrity out of the phase response as you can get. Now, the laws of physics say if you've got a perfect phase response, you'll get a perfect frequency response. So although a perfect frequency response is the measured result, what you're actually aiming for is the perfect phase response. And the same goes for the low frequencies as well. What happened inside the box, and we didn't really reckon on this, was that you're eliminating all the standing waves and weird stuff that goes on inside the box because there are no parallel surfaces, basically, or not enough to create standing waves. So all of the energy that's trapped in the box, if you like, becomes a homogeneous mass of energy. And when that fires out of the base port, it comes out much more smoothly and in a much more regular fashion than most ports. And that's very, very noticeable. It's one of the first things people notice about the speaker. The bass response is very, very tight, but very extended at the same time, and none of the boominess that you quite often get coming out of a small ported box.
So it's a two-way design with a port. And there's also behind me, you can't see it here in the video, but behind me there's a controller box and amplifier that matches up with these. How does that factor into the system?
Well, let me explain why we put it in a separate box, basically. Having designed the perfect egg-shaped speaker, we couldn't find anywhere to put the amplifier because it would have interfered with the perfect egg-shaped speaker. And we thought, well, why not put everything in one box that you've actually got access to, so when you're sitting at your console, it's right there. You can change the level. Then we said, well, why not have two inputs? So you can have your main monitor input from your desk or whatever, and you can have an auxiliary input, which can be a playback, from your mastering system or whatever you want, really. And having two completely independent channels, stereo channels. That made a lot of sense. And then we said, oh, well, why not put a little bit of EQ on the front panel? So we put in a very subtle mid-range EQ, whereby you have a hard setting, which is a little bit like an NS10 kind of sound, a little bit lifted in the mid-range, or a neutral flat response, or a little soft smiley response, which is a little bit more like the hi-fi speaker guys. And that's really for playback and listening for pleasure. But these are subtle things. They're only about 1.5 dB difference between them over a relatively small band, about an octave and a half. But it really just gives you that little bit of choice as to the way you want to listen. And it actually emulates quite a few different speakers by doing that. And it's a very useful tool. And then you've got all the usual presets for bass, top-end control, sensitivity adjustments. You can adjust the speakers left and right. Each speaker's marked left and right, and you set them up as such, so you can get very precise balancing.
Okay, so they're not identical. There is actually a side to them.
Yeah, the loudspeaker manufacturers around these days can't really produce drivers with a consistency with an envelope much better than about 1.5 to 2 dBs, something like that. There are lots of reasons for that, which I can't go into now, but it's a fact. So what we've done basically, we've put into the system the ability to tune that 2 dB envelope, say, down to 0.5 dB. So you get absolutely perfect balance matching independently between the bass drivers and the tweeters. Okay. And that's set up in the factory. So every system comes out with that perfect balance.
So it's a matched pair of speakers then coming from the factory.
Yeah.
Right. So clearly then, even though the speakers themselves are passive, you have to use them with your electronic package. Yeah. It really is a whole,
there's a whole bunch of stuff
integrated package
going on there. Yeah, right. It's completely integrated.
Right, right. And these are being distributed through and manufactured through SE Electronics?
Yeah, SE do the manufacturing. The headquarters and distribution worldwide for SE is done by Sonic Distribution in England.
Okay.
So the headquarters is in England, which is where I'm based. Most of the R&D for this has been done in England, in fact, although a lot of the work on the cabinet manufacturing was done by SE Electronics in Shanghai, in fact. And there's quite a task, actually. It's not easy making eggs, right. I have to say. One interesting thing is they're very lightweight. They're incredibly light compared to a conventional speaker cabinet, and that's because they're made from a very, very thin resin-impregnated plastic, which is pretty well unbreakable, but very, very stiff. They're actually stiffer than glass.
Wow.
Which means that what resonances there would be are very high in frequency, so they're not excited by the bass driver, so that the resonances that might happen just don't. So the net result is no resonances at all. And we've put accelerometers on these things and we've measured them in anechoic chambers and you name it. We cannot find any resonances, full stop.
Wow.
And that's the first time that I've ever managed to achieve that, certainly.
So audio engineers, recording engineers, mastering engineers are notorious for having their speakers that they love and the sound that they have and the sound that they're used to. Are most engineers comfortable when these come in and they set them up next to their old faithfuls, if you will, or is it a big shift, or how has it been perceived?
Well, I would say the overwhelming reaction, and I would say more than 9 out of 10, the reaction is the eggs have a transparency that they're not used to hearing, and it makes other speakers sound like they have a sound of their own. And they can, I won't mention brand names, but each speaker basically seems to have a characteristic sound, which people either like or don't like.
Sure.
But the egg seems to have a neutrality about it. You tend to hear behind the speaker into the mix.
Right.
And you can hear the good things and the bad things about the mix. And you do hear the bad things. And even just like playing an MP3 file becomes almost painful because you're just aware of it somehow. You're just aware of the lack of dynamic and fidelity and resolution in that sound.
Right.
And it allows you to hear that clearly. And I think that's the overwhelming reaction that we've had from almost everybody, certainly today. It's been amazing.
So it's a good thing and a bad thing, because if you have illusions about how your music sounds, and
you can't hide. There's nowhere to hide, basically.
Right.
And that's what a monitor's for. I mean, that's the definition of a monitor. That is the point.
Right.
Yeah, these are tools. They're professional tools. It's not something to impress your friends and neighbours, although it may well do that.
Sure.
And I have tried these on my friends and neighbours, and they are impressed.
Right, right. And if it sounds good on these, it's going to sound good pretty much anywhere else you're going to play.
If it sounds good on these, I guarantee you won't be disappointed anywhere else. I absolutely guarantee that, personally. So there you go.
That's wonderful. We're very excited about these. You're actually here today giving demos for our sales engineers, letting them hear the speakers and
and I've been amazed at the throughput, actually. I think just about everybody's been through the room today.
Everybody's very interested.
Yeah, that's great.
And I'm very excited. I've been promised a review set for, we'll see a review coming in Sweet Notes very soon, so watch for that. And I'm anxious to get my ears on these as well.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it.
Been a pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
I'm Mitch Gallagher. Thanks for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute.